Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Keynote on Speaking Engagement. I'm your host, Ryan Catherwood. On the show this week, I've got Nathan Chappell. Nathan is the co-author of The Generosity Crisis. He is the Chief AI Officer at Virtuous, and he is the co-founder of fundraising.ai. I had the chance to hear Nathan speak at a Washburn McGoldrick client conference a couple of years ago. And since that time, I've had the generosity crisis and a lot of the themes in the book on my mind ever since. I tried to think about the notion of radical connection and some of the other concepts from the book that we'll be studying in our book club over the next 2 months. If you haven't registered for that, be sure to hit up our website and drop your name in the interest form so we can have you a part of our book club. But as you'll hear in my conversation with Nathan, he has a great sense of where he believes the future of our space is headed. Good as anybody. The idea of N1 philanthropy, which you'll hear about in this conversation, might be the first time that you've heard about this notion of how the future of donor engagement is hyper-personalized. I know you'll enjoy my conversation. Please pick up a copy of The Generosity Crisis, and if you are not already a member of Speaking Engagement, consider joining our community. All right, thank you so much. Enjoy my interview with Nathan Chappell. Nathan Chappell, thank you so much for being on the Keynote on Speaking Engagement. It is so great to have you on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
This is an exciting edition of the Keynote because we are also kicking off our first ever book club reading The Generosity Crisis. And I heard you speak several years ago now, I think when the book first came out at a Washburn McGoldrick conference. And ever since then, I've kept that book kind of close by my desk. And the idea of radical connection, which we'll talk about, is one that I've had on the forefront of my mind the last few years. But maybe I could ask you just to set us up about the book itself. You open up by imagining a world where generosity has disappeared entirely. Why do you think it was important to begin the story there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. There's people take action based on different circumstances. And I'm a person that if I know what's at stake, I'm more likely to take action. Others might be, if they're inspired to do something that might motivate them to do something, differently. But for me personally, I think it's just my own personal bias that if I understood what was at stake, in a particular situation, it would motivate me to actually do something about it. And so, in fact, early on, when we decided to write the book, of course, it was not a very popular title to write a book called The Generosity Crisis and sell it to really optimistic people. Probably wasn't the world's, most marketing people would say, don't do that. But it was, even the title itself was just to, kind of shock the system a little bit and be like, what's going on? And is this, something I need to care about? And in fact, the first, to your point, the opening chapter is a bit dystopian. I was actually wanting to be even more dystopian, but we paired it back a little bit to like get people to read chapter 2. So, I have been told the first 100 pages can be, they're pretty stark. There's a lot of data, and irrefutably, I think you can't get through the first 100 pages without recognizing that doing things the same way will yield, or continue on this path of the decline in civic engagement.
I think a lot of people who even do this work for a living don't necessarily have a full sense of what would happen if the generosity of folks just continued to decline into nothing. When the book first came out a few years ago, what were you most concerned about?
Yeah, I think I was actually concerned about what you just spoke about, is that a majority of people in our sector, about 10 million people in our sector, have no idea or had no idea at the time that the sector wasn't healthy. And, I came to this realization in a couple different ways, but one was, I spent 20 years as a fundraiser and a fundraising leader. And there were probably two moments. One moment was when I spent an entire afternoon with one of our PhDs. I was at UC San Diego. I had a PhD on my team, and we spent an entire afternoon talking about and used the term how to build a better mousetrap. And that to me was interesting in retrospect. I never thought anything was wrong. Like that was just like how we were, the job was hard and we had to figure out how to raise more money when we knew, things were difficult. And we spent an entire afternoon referring to donors as mice. The thing is that realization didn't hit me for a couple of years later when I thought, how is it possible that I spent 20 years doing this job and spent 60 hours a week doing it, and the job had never gotten easier? Like that math just didn't seem right. And I got really really interested in Giving USA, and I started reading cover to cover Giving USA and reading the footnotes of Giving USA. So it's like a culmination of those things of like what it felt like fundraising and realizing it wasn't getting easier, and then looking at the data, realizing that while the numbers, gross numbers were going up and giving remained resilient at 2.1% of GDP for 40 years, that Giving USA essentially extracted what they consider basically outsized gifts. So the mega gifts they would actually take out of the report every year, and it just turned out, if you look at the footnotes, that they were taking more that pie was growing every year. So if total dollars were the same or growing, but it was coming from essentially a much smaller group of people. And so that it was all those things that came together where I thought, man, what is going on? Because when Giving USA would come out and said, we just raised $500 billion, everyone would be high fiving. But then they go back to work the next day thinking, my job is so much harder. Everybody else must be doing so well. So I think
Yeah.
it really stemmed from just that disconnect of those feelings of like, is this what it feels like, or is this, what does the data say about it?
Looking back now, the book was published a couple of years ago. Has anything changed? Has the outlook improved, worsened? What do you think?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define outlook. So, from a data perspective or from an awareness perspective, I think there's a lot more awareness now. And it turns out when the book was released, the Generosity Commission had basically launched their effort to study giving and volunteerism in America, kind of the seminal research. It took them a couple years to like do all the research and publish their findings. So it but that and the book Generosity Crisis created a lot of awareness about like, what do you mean like things aren't great? And what is where is the disconnect? And really the some of the book kind of came to me after it was written in having probably about 10,000 conversations. I traveled all over, really over the world. I went to Hong Kong and Canada and the UK and of course the US, and spoke to so many professionals and realized that they were like resonating with this, like, oh my gosh, like you just put into words kind of how it has felt for all this time. So I think there's a lot more awareness, and that awareness hopefully is causing some action to prioritize things like lifetime value and retention versus just revenue and expenses. But the data kind of says it says other things. So of course, COVID happened, and we saw a spike in generosity, and so it proved that people are still generous and can be if motivated in the right way. But then after COVID kind of subsided, most nonprofits went back doing the same thing that they had done before. And so we're seeing this continual kind of erosion of, the middle class donor, if you will. So, the giving or fundraising effectiveness project data kind of continues to be troubling. Even Virtuous has their own survey or study that we just did, the benchmark report. And it's just, unfortunately, many signs are pointing to the same direction, that nonprofits are still essentially treating donors like transactions, and therefore I don't want to get too far ahead, but therefore are essentially opting out. And there's a lot of other reasons we can unpack here as well. It's not just that part.
I definitely want to get into the changing dynamic post COVID and how we should be thinking about connection and what we must be doing differently as we forge ahead from here. Um, is there anything about the book that you might write differently at this juncture, knowing what you know now a few years later?
That's a good question. I think the idea of the competition for connection really came out. I mean, it shows up in the book a little bit, but it really hit home after in a pretty profound way. And of course, because the book was written 13 days before ChatGPT came out, and so we didn't really see that competition for connection as pervasive as we do now. And so we have a different kind of mindset when we're looking at it. And so already the average person interacts with between 5 to 7,000 algorithms per day. Nonprofits are not competing with other nonprofits, especially not for discretionary dollars. They're competing for connection. And so I would definitely, double down on that part. The aspect that, attention span is 25% worse than it was just 20 years ago. We are inundated. The average person scrolls 300 feet on their phone a day and receives 144 emails. So, it's not nonprofits that are creating that as much as it is the private sector, but nonprofits are largely unaware and continue to follow the same tactics and techniques that they've always done, not realizing that the biggest competition is coming from the private sector, and it's for that connection. Now, flip
Yeah.
side, I if I was to do, we've talked about doing a sequel. I actually believe that community is a growth industry because of the synthetic nature of where society is going, and because of AI. And as things get even, more, faster and more synthetic over time, that people are going back to that. It's what we describe as radical connection, but going back into that thing of like, where do I belong? Like, where is my sense of belonging? Who am I? What am I here for? What happens when I die? And that would be, I think, for the nonprofit industry, that actually is, if we're ready for that and we approach it in the right way, then there's a huge opportunity there.
Think we're ready for it mentally, but in terms of our ability to manage the challenge of community building, which is inherently a slow and steady wins the race, focusing on disciplined relationship building, content creation, we're a what do the numbers look like and how do we make them bigger right now,
Right.
and it's a little bit of a runs in contrast, I think, to how nonprofits and colleges and universities definitely think about the
Mhm.
fundraising today.
Yeah. I mean, it does take discipline, to your point of, not only looking at what you're trying to do, classify that as filling the leaky bucket. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, when, one of the things that I heard after the book was written and I went on and did my world tour, I heard from really established leaders who had been in the sector, very successful for, 20, 30, 40 years, come to me and say, you know what, this book really resonates. It reminds me of why I got into fundraising to begin with and why I love this sector. But, to make this change would put me at risk of keeping my job, because I need to, I have to fill that leaky bucket. And the only way I keep my job is to fill that leaky bucket. And so therefore I'm going to continue to, prioritize wealthy people, continue to go for the big swings. And maybe just incrementally, this is kind of you know, the shame of it was like, well, maybe I'll just like tweak around the edges. And in fact, we started writing a sequel. And then I ended up writing Nonprofit AI. So we have about 5 chapters done in the sequel of Generosity Crisis called the Generosity Reboot. And that was essentially that idea that, incremental changes won't work in an exponential world. And like a reboot on your computer, this is not like a small little tweak. This is like Control Alt Delete and like start over with, a more holistic, relationship centered type of fundraising.
It's extremely important, but as you said, that full reboot is really hard to imagine in our sector. I think it's incredibly important. But let's get to some of the real causes of the decline in giving that you talk about in the generosity crisis. What do you believe is at the heart of declining participation in giving? You outline a number of different reasons, but if there is one or a few that I think are
Sure.
particularly impactful for the decline, what do you think those are?
Yeah, I mean, and that's where people want to, they want to know who to blame and where, where's that root cause, or in looking for the silver bullet in all of it, right? But it's a really
Yeah.
complicated systemic issue, and so the book unpacks not even all of them, but a myriad of reasons. Some of which you look at the connection to like religious association, and so from a religious participation, the average person that participates in any religion is twice as likely to give and gives twice as much. And so there's that aspect of it. There's just the inundation of multi-channel. And so, you know, the donor fatigue is at an all-time high because you've got 1.7 million nonprofits no longer sending mail, but sending super advanced, mail and text messages and emails and letters and premiums and all the things. And it just gets overwhelming. The biggest one for me is going back to what we were just talking about, the competition for connection. And it's not even stem from the nonprofit sector. It's attention span as a result of overstimulus and social media. But it's, essentially that the private sector has gotten really advanced. The private sector at some point learned that the connection between the heart and the wallet and reframed what success for business means. So when I was an undergrad, success for business meant returning value to shareholders at any expense. That was pretty much, I could have skipped 5 years of undergrad business school to just understand that that was the only premise of business, is to return value to shareholders at any cost. And that was a cost to employees or cost to the environment. Didn't really matter, in the 90s. But somehow along the way, the for-profit sector began to understand the connection between the heart and the wallet, and they began to think about lifetime value. And then they started building mechanisms to find not just people to sell more products to, but to build deeper relationships with, that they could sell more products to for a longer period of time. And so the entire stock market is now hinged upon future value. And so how sticky is your business, and how well are you able to predict future revenue based on how deep your customers love you today? That was inherently a nonprofit play forever. And now it's not the nonprofit play. It's largely, I mean, that is the declarative position for pretty much every for-profit business today. And nonprofits just now have to find a way to essentially, be distinct in all of that.
Recall in the book where you were mentioning, an individual who has been typically philanthropic, giving to a cause, and he's grappling with the idea of buying a Tesla, and the purchase of the Tesla being something that checks the box in that person's mind because he's supporting green energy, he's supporting the planet, and this purchase in and of itself, this relationship with a for-profit company in that person's mind sort of cancels out or supersedes the
Mhm.
relationship with the nonprofit in a way that's clear. I guess I was wondering as I was reading it, maybe Tesla has changed as a result of our political environment or other. But do you think this type of relationship that people have with the for-profit sector remains as strong today as the way you were describing it 3 years ago?
Yeah, even stronger. I mean, if you look at, studies like the Edelman Trust Barometer, which basically studies trust in between the government, media, for-profit, and nonprofit. For-profit organizations are the most trusted entity. The reason why, and trust, the way they essentially assess trust is based on competency and ethics. And so now, as of a few years ago, for-profits are trusted more than nonprofits on the basis of ethics and competency. Nonprofits have always been deemed more ethical, but for-profits have moved up that rank a lot. And the reason why they've moved up that rank a lot is because the way they talk. Elon Musk was interviewed by Chris Anderson, the head of TED Talk organization, and said, I quote, "All of my companies are philanthropy." And then he went on to talk about and name every one of his companies and how they meet the definition of philanthropy, which is a love of humankind, for different reasons. And so, the for-profit sector has been very much, I think, in tune with individual consumers. 51% of consumers won't buy from a product that defies their values. So they're building products that speak to and align with values, whether it's Subaru, putting dogs in all of their cars and their commercials because, the people who buy Subarus love dogs, or it's, or the more traditional type of like, you know, B Corp, good cause, kind of for profits like Bombas or, Patagonia or any of those. But it's definitely become more pronounced and more concentrated over time. And I don't think that will be less for any, in any near term. And when we look at future buyers and future consumers, Gen Z it's a great example because Vogue Business did a study last year, and the conclusion of this entire study was that the secret sauce for marketers today for Gen Z are that, to make them feel that they're part of a community. That was like literally the quote, like to make them feel that they're part of a community and, not to be the community, but to make them feel that they're part of a community. So that is a kind of pervasive narrative for marketers today is to create a sense of belonging or, at least synthetic belonging that consumers be like, oh, this is my group. I want to, be a part of this.
Yeah, a dynamic that you pointing it out in the book may have been the first time anyone really had thought along those lines in terms of the way in which for-profit companies are creating this sense of belonging. And what is the word that you used in the book to describe this particular concept? It's uh,
Yeah. The radical connection.
well, it was the
That
word
part.
I'm thinking of was like you philanthropic economics. I should have written this
Oh,
down. It's
philanthrocapitalism.
there we go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Philanthrocapitalism. Yeah, sort of describes this particular dynamic where they are very in tune with how people make decisions and remain loyal. In your book, you describe 5 myths that are driving the generosity crisis. Has any one of those myths proven to be particularly damaging?
Probably, and some of these are more modern, in terms of my thinking, but the scarcity mindset, is that nonprofits, one are, they don't have enough resources. They don't, have, all the things at their disposal. Frankly, AI becomes an incredible level setter. It democratizes intelligence, it democratizes creativity and strategy. And so that myth is disproving itself right now. Now, nonprofits have to break free from that. That scarcity mindset and really switch to more of an infinity mindset. But I think that is, that's one of the things that I think is, when we're facing all these headwinds that the nonprofit sector is facing. So, public scrutiny and the political upheaval and just pure apathy that average person who's just not even thinking about charity. Those things, can be completely overwhelming and debilitating. But also at the same time, not by design, but by just chance, we're presented with technology that knows something about everything and it's read every book on consumer behavior and every case for support and can be an incredible, you know, a power boost for nonprofit. And so I think that that becomes, one of the things. Other than that, not necessarily a myth, but this idea that more was better. I think that has been, for most of my career, it was like if I spent more, I would raise more and I would do incrementally better. And it's still largely true from a math perspective, but that myth is more transactions, but more is not better. And so I think that that myth really had, I think more people in the sector are really understanding the reality, like the cost to acquire a donor that only retains at 19% is not going to be something that, the future will reward. And so, I think that myth has been, subtly breaking down pretty clearly. And so the demand for better retention strategies and things like that are definitely on the rise.
This is where a lot of my work combines with the idea of radical connection and retention strategies, because in the area of alumni engagement, donor engagement, right there, we are often thinking about engaging those who have never engaged before and building a pipeline that leads to eventually philanthropic contributions. And where we often miss is all these thousands of people who are already engaged with our philanthropic community and retaining that
Uh,
engagement across a lifetime. But maybe you could comment just a little bit more on the notion of scarcity versus infinity mindset. Is that notion of infinity mindset sort of the thinking that instead of thinking we don't have enough, we can never do enough, it's that we have access to everything, we can do whatever we want?
yeah, yeah. I mean, this is something, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, writing about now, is that, for most of my career, 20 years, the scarcity mindset is a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are being measured on only spending 20% of your, total dollars on your fundraising or communication. So, the cost per dollar raised is the driving factor. That means that very few organizations have any budget for research and development. So any kind of like philanthropic R&D is unheard of in the nonprofit sector. So, I remember early days that my first nonprofit job was at a Boys and Girls Club. And, we didn't have a lot of money. We had like $25,000 in a savings account. And we're like, well, if we want to um, really, do something innovative, we're going to have to tap into that. And, I remember the hard tension of it, me as a director and the board wrestling with, well, if we do this and it fails, that means that potentially there's like less kids that we could save from a gang, if it fails. So that tension's very real. But at the same time, if I look back at those early days and if I were presented with technology like generative AI and agentic AI, I could go back and rethink everything about what we're trying to solve for, not just like this incremental. So the scarcity mindset is very incremental. It's like, well, we've done this in the past. Let's just do 1% more, 3% more, 5% more. Well, the infinity mindset is like, what is the work that we're actually trying to achieve? Like, what caused us? Like, what were we trying to solve when we got into this business to begin with? And do those same parameters even apply anymore? Or are there new and different ways to be thinking about what we're trying to achieve? The infinity mindset assumes anything is possible and then is allowed to be proven wrong versus thinking about incremental change over time. And so that's the part, like, while there's, a book called The Generosity Crisis, because there is a generosity crisis or, a charitable giving crisis, that, I think there are two things that are that will play very favorably. One is that community being a growth industry, that people are seeking a deeper sense of like what it means to be here. And then the other is to have technology that is affordable and accessible that can allow us to rethink those historical biases of what we couldn't do. And so that's where, I guess it had it not been for those things, or it had not been for that, at least in the AI portion, the story just ends and it's just like overwhelming and it's daunting. And there's really not a lot of hope, because it would resolve, or it would end with just a bunch of good people trying to like retool their entire organization. I mean, it would be overwhelming and just probably impossible.
I want to think about the idea of radical connection and meaning, and think about what practitioners can do about this problem. Because I feel like the folks who are subscribers, who are members of speaking engagement, most of them are in the field of higher ed advancement, and in particular are thinking about community building and engagement and the idea of radical connection and how to bring it to life tactically and through different strategies that help solve this problem. But first, let's set it up. Maybe you could just give listeners an overview of the difference between transactional connection versus radical connection.
Yeah. And in fairness, it wasn't, there's not a magic word that, it was just something that, we couldn't afford a PR agency to come up with a whole campaign about a different word. But when I looked back, and we share this in the book, where, you have, a study of democracy where the US really stood out. So Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote Letters of Democracy, and he talks about this like deep affiliation and association that people had. Like, he went all over the world, and when he came to the US, he was like, this is really unique, is that people would like gather outside their homes to better their community because they had this deep affiliation or association with, Red Cross or whoever, whatever community effort they were trying to achieve. And, fast forward, obviously, things have gotten just a little bit more complicated in 100 years or more than 100 years. And, affiliation and association are just table stakes. They're everywhere. Like, I mean, how many, the average person has like 12 subscriptions, and you have these affiliations and associations with so many different things, and they all can't be equal. And so, the idea that radical connection was this, to move across. Now, it also recognized that when I started fundraising, 2/3 of Americans gave to charity. And that was, so I could walk down the street or go to Starbucks and literally 2 out of 3 Americans could tell me who their favorite charity was and why. And 20 years later, building the better mousetrap is that, less than half, I think the number right now is 46.8. So givers are now the minority. So affiliation, association no longer work. We need to think about reframing what connection means. And so radical connection was a framework that we proposed that, goes beyond something that it's like, you'll affiliate it with it when it's convenient for you. So you can think about brands or nonprofits that you're like, oh, I marginally care about that if it's convenient and it's like presented to me the right time, the right way. But there's others that you'll go out of your way for. I'm a Patagonia fan, so I'll get an Uber, in some new city and spend $16 in an Uber ride to go to a Patagonia that's never in a convenient place to kind of see what they have that's new. And same is true for nonprofits. So, nonprofits that build this radical connection, it's not just I know you or you know me. It's like I know you and you know me. Like we belong to the same thing. We communicate well. There's authenticity, there's transparency, and that, there's a lot to unpack in the book on that because, you know, donors want to know, what does this organization stand for? Are their values aligned with my values? Not just everything that's shiny and packaged perfectly. It's just that, there's a sense of belonging between the two. And so I think it requires a new openness in that kind of authenticity and transparency that, the synthetic world won't do readily. So it's a new framework. And there are several principles in the book, and we always just encourage people to essentially take those. And if you want to know where your donors stand on that continuum of affiliation or radical connection, all you have to do is ask them and create a survey, these 10 questions, like, do you like us or do you love us? Do you, or is this something that you prefer or something that you look forward to? And, it's so simple from a practitioner perspective, especially when in the area that you're talking about. You have to be willing to want to know the answer, but to, really get down and find out where people are at, where is their heart as it's related to your organization, and then be prepared to do something about it.
Well, I guess that's the big question that our field faces is, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier. So do you think that in that example where an alumni office and advancement office surveys their graduates to get that sense of love us, like us, that they should be focused on those who love them and really build radical, because one of the other questions that I have is you also talk about you can't have radical connection with everyone,
Right. That's true.
right? So talk
Yeah.
about sort of the intersection of scalability of radical connection and how to be thinking about it.
No, that's a good point, because there are people that are going to give transactionally to you that, it was fine. It was a moment in time. But then you spend 15 years, following. I mean, I still, and somehow they found me when I moved from California to Tennessee. I still get a direct mail appeal from an AM radio station in Nome, Alaska. Like, I don't even know how I got on the list, but I mean, it's been at least 15 years. And I might have seen them or looked at something on their website at one point for some weird reason. So, I think it is that idea of like, using that data to prioritize people that do have a deeper sense, not to abandon those that don't. I mean, one of the most successful things I've ever done like when I did feasibility studies, when I was a consultant would be, is this organization one of your top 3 charities? If not, what would it take to get there? And so if someone's honest with you and it says, never, like I just, I gave to you, one time and that was it because, my neighbor's, brother's uncle told me I should, totally fine, bless and release. But if there's someone who responds and says, it would take this and these are like actionable things of like, the fact that I made a gift and I never heard back, or, I only hear from you when you want money. Those are actionable things that you can take to improve. And so, higher ed's a little bit different because, and I've been talking to my friend Mallory Erickson a lot about this, is that, higher ed, no matter how good or bad the fundraising is, that person is still affiliated with the organization. Whereas in 99% of nonprofits, the donor journey is the affiliation. And so, if because I don't have this degree that nobody can take away. It's one of the few things in life that can't be taken from you. And so, no matter what, and no matter how much I hate the advancement shop because they like only just, they say, dear alum. And, I only hear when they want money and they never even, and it's not personalized to my degree or anything like that, that I'm still affiliated with that organization. It can't be taken away. So it's a little bit different. And I do think that you have to find the people that are, unfortunately, data gives you the opportunity to look at like how people are engaging, whether they're volunteering, whether they're advocating, whether they're looking at websites, sharing things, whatever it might be, and then donating, attending events, and things like that. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's really frees us from this idea that more is better. More is not better. Better is better, and that focus on those that are going to go the distance, and then the rest of them, it's fine. It's okay. Like,
In our space, we've created 4 categories of engagement. You're probably familiar with this: communications, experiential, volunteer, and philanthropy. And of those first three categories, there is, I think, a conversation happening right now as to not all engagement is created equal, right? That is to
mhm.
say, volunteers are contributors by way of providing time, and the connection that they have is almost certainly more radical. Would you concur with that statement, and just talk a little about the nature and the importance of volunteerism across nonprofits, but maybe particularly in higher ed?
Yeah, volunteerism, it is the actually number one, and we can prove this with data science. It's the number one indicator of connection. And so, in fact, our first data science project in AI was in 2017, 2018. And we actually were looking at data from, about 100 million records, and found that somebody attending an event, but not just one time, not two, but three times, was the highest indication that person would ever have to making a major gift. So if you think about this and we reverse engineer it, it showed up in every model that we did, is that event attendance and volunteerism ended up being like the highest indication because most people in studies will show that they will put a monetary value of volunteerism as the same as dollars. So like any Gen Alphas now will say that volunteering is equal to money, and that's part of stage of life. But then, you go to an event, you're basically volunteering your time to go to that event. You're like, well, I'm going to this thing because someone said I should. But then second year you go again because it wasn't horrible. And, there was something about it that interests you. But the third year, you're going to that event a third time. And it's something that because you found your group. Volunteering is the same way. And all of the studies will show that, the decline in charitable participation has been the same as the decline in volunteerism. Basically, kind of like they've gone down, whether it's people donating blood or people donate or delivering meals with Meals on Wheels. All of those. And Meals on Wheels has had to start paying people to deliver meals for the first time in their history, which is just a signal. So I think there's man, this is the thing. When I was a nonprofit, we were not really rewarded to get people to volunteer. Like it was not something that was like it wasn't looked favorably upon because it seemed expensive and there wasn't or there was no short term reward. But every data science project will show you that volunteering and anytime you can get people to take action, like a physical action, like attend an event or volunteer to show up at something, that's where they're voting their hand up and they're saying I'm associated with this organization. So those are the people that you really should double down on. And then sadly, most organizations do a very poor job of tracking volunteerism and thanking volunteers in the same way that they would, or even in a more profound way than they would, through monetary donation.
Yeah, there's definitely a gap in the way that we recognize volunteers, and also the amount of volunteer opportunities that are created. Usually they're board based, and
Hmm.
the boards themselves are geared around creating events. And alumni teams particularly are really good at creating events. And so
Right.
there's this interesting roadblock across higher ed where there's just not enough volunteerism to scale for all the people that want to have radical connection. You outlined several principles for establishing radical connection. Is one of those potentially more important than others?
You know, I don't know that one is more important than another. It's a mindset versus, a tactic as well. Like it has to go beyond the transaction. And so it does require a discipline of going back and auditing your fundraising practices and looking at like how much effort and time and money are we spending on securing a donation versus, stewarding that and building a relationship with someone. At the simplest form, and during my book tour, I used to ask people all the time. I'd be like, how many people, I mean, your revenue, of course, and most people know their expenses, but they don't know their retention or they don't know their retention goal. And so, there's not to say that money, is important. Money is or not important. Money is important. It's just whether or not when you're reporting out on your success, are you prioritizing revenue and expenses, or are you prioritizing, you know, LTV and retention? And so, in one board that I serve on the board of, we've actually reframed our board document. So the two top line items of the entire board report are not revenue and expenses, but they are lifetime value and retention. And that is it's a big, like it's an easy thing. It costs no money, but it's a complete reframing of like, what are we prioritizing? And so I think radical connection comes with this a sense of, the fact that what got us here won't get us there, that we need to reframe, systems that actually reward and create incentives around keeping people long term. When I was at City of Hope, a cancer center, we moved to a 3-year rolling average for how we evaluated fundraising. And so instead of being at just 1 year, it became 3 years. And that allowed us to build deeper connection because it was no longer based on, my timeline. It was based on the donor's timeline. And sadly, when I've asked, I've done this a lot in sessions that I've led or workshops where I've asked, how many of you have ever solicited someone before you knew they were ready? And about 100% of hands go up. And then I'll ask, how many people have you waited to solicit someone because you already hit your goal and you wanted to start the next year out strong? About 100% of the hands go up. And so there's awareness that some of the practices that we are participating in are transactional, and they're transactional to fit a certain rubric that wasn't designed around the donor. And so I think that idea of radical connection has to be systemic first. It has to be a reframing of like, how are you evaluating success? And then to do the things like, really well that help bring people in and acknowledge them, use the data that you have about them to, make sure that they hear you, that it's like, oh, like I'm heard, my unique skill set or my unique, perspective on, this organization is valued. And that's what the private sector does really well. They use all
Yeah.
the data at their disposal to essentially personalize, communication.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, asking you this question as I was hearing you talk, because you're so knowledgeable about the whole space, but in particular, the institutions of higher education and other educational organizations about this challenge that they're facing. Imagine that you are a newly hired alumni director and you're tasked with helping to be part of the donor pipeline development process, meaning you have to have more enhanced connectivity with the work of raising philanthropic funds. However, you cannot lose the approach to trying to scale relationships and create more radical connection. It cannot be more transactional. What it's come to your mind first as you might think about what to do?
Like heaven forbid, I think I'll probably have nightmares around it. No, I mean, I, there's a whole new world. I mean, again, not to harp on this, and I'm biased around AI, but in fact, I'm writing a new book. I have 2 more chapters to go called N1 Philanthropy, and N1 Philanthropy believes that there's no donors or prospects. There's just individuals that have a varying degree of connection to you, and you can use both the kind of trifecta of machine learning, generative AI, and agentic AI to essentially mine that data and create, essentially personalization at scale. So if I was a brand new, like, alumni director, I would be probably one of the most annoying, curious people on the planet, and literally looking at agentic AI and how it can help me build that connection at scale. The thing about this book is a glimpse to the future of generosity, but it's rooted in technology that exists today. And so it will come out in a few months, but we're like, I mean, this it's actually quite an exciting time to think about like what's possible, that you could do if you're a curious generalist, alumni director, like, and you got super deep into like what you could actually do with the technology that already exists, and know that technology that doesn't exist that will be here in a year from now will be even more profound. And so I do think we're about to enter, I think, a phase that has like kind of two counterparts: a phase where personalization at scale is finally real, so that like micro segmentation, like N of one, that's what it's called. N1 Philanthropy is the name of the book. So every individual's unique, but also going back to the part where, as things become more synthetic, people are looking for more connection. So making sure that, the good thing is the nonprofit sector doesn't have to, pretend to be part of the community, because they are the community. And so really, open the arms and invite people into that.
Love the idea of getting folks excited about the future as opposed to apprehensive about the, future of AI, because I feel like I spend a lot of time thinking about the the detriments of it and not enough about how it can really stimulate growth and philanthropy. And you talk about joy a lot in your book too, it's in terms of an essential ingredient around
Hmm.
philanthropy. But let's get people excited in the time we have together and talk about N1 and where you see things headed for those institutions that are able to cut free of legacy approaches. How do you think that moving forward, we're able to navigate the challenge of the attention economy, where generosity depends on reaching people in moments where they just have seconds to make a connection? And we talk about that being one of the challenges that's being faced. Where do you see AI helping institutions being able to deal with the problem of connectivity and capturing attention?
Yeah, I mean, one of the areas that what it can do is something that's unique to the nonprofit sector, where, one is that the lure of using AI to create efficiency will be to do more bad fundraising. So this idea that if you have a bad fundraising practice and you put something digital on top of it, you have a digital bad fundraising practice. And
Yeah.
so to acknowledge first that there's going to be this, the unaware, uninformed person will be like, okay, we're going to use this technology, and we're just going to scale everything up 20%, and we're going to burn everybody out like really quickly. But conversely, the leader with discipline is going to say, you know what? We are going to set a goal, and the goal is to increase efficiency of every employee by 20%. And then with that 20%, we are going to make sure that we reserve that time, the dividend of time, to do things that are inherently human. And so, and I heard a leader last week literally use those words and talk exactly like this. So there's this awareness of like, we can create efficiency, but instead of burning out people 20% faster, we're going to give them their joy back. We're going to give them the life back. And that 20% of time is where you convert. By the way, 20% of a week is a day. So like, if you can create 20%, of your time back, you've got an extra day a week for every employee. So every admin, every prospect researcher, every fundraiser, everyone. And if you think about what could be possible if every person or organization had every Friday, all day Friday, and all they did was do personal connection, like whether that looked like writing handwritten notes to people that, were on top of your mind, but you didn't get to, whether it was taking that donor out for coffee to hear all about their grandkids, and, not to make an ask, but an extra day a week for every employee. So this is where I get super bullish and optimistic about. Now it takes a lot of resolve to do this, and a leader who's aware that doing more of the same is going to actually just burn people out faster, and actually will probably, just burn donors out faster too. But I think of AI as being this opportunity to allow us to get back to center of what's actually really important. It's the area that actually would allow us to do the radical connection that would be so hard otherwise. Because what are we going to trade off we don't have enough time to do this and that. So, really focusing on the efficiency side of it.
When you talk about focusing on the efficiency side of it, I mean, I hear you talking about taking out of the routines of folks who work in the operational side of nonprofits, the crafting of language, the sending of emails. What do you mean in terms of using AI to create efficiencies? Because sometimes when I think about a transactional relationship or reaching out to people at scale and personalizing, I often think about how you can tell AI wrote something,
Right,
or you can
right,
tell like the thing that I just got was not a human that sent it. And
right.
like it turns me off. So how do you combat that?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is where, we moved even away from this idea of human in the loop. So, human in the loop is to ensure that AI never does anything without a human kind of being responsible for it. But we moved from
Yeah.
that to human at the helm. So, the human at the helm is actually the person who's actually directing it and accountable for what that AI is going to do. And so, of course, operations things, gift processing, even building a donor relations plan for every donor, which is like an unheard of thing. I remember we spent a year at UCSD doing 1,000 research profiles on our 1,000 top prospects for $1 billion campaign that we were doing. Took a year, and we're talking like 4 people for a year. That could be done in like a week, now. So from those types of operational things, AI makes sense all day long. But even for a fundraiser, if you have AI, and so like we have a product called Momentum, but if you show up and it had already looked at your prospects that hadn't been reached out in a specific cadence, and it drafted an email in your voice, but it didn't send it, that you were looking at that and saying like, okay, like, I'm going to send this out and reach out for coffee. And if AI even looked at the geography of where you lived and actually recommended, one or two or three coffee shops that you could say, oh, like, do you want to meet at, Mon Ami? And, so even a fundraiser can benefit from AI serving it things that would actually increase efficacy and also do it faster. And this just, you know, means that we have to kind of audit the things that we spend, the amount of time that we spend behind a screen. So essentially, AI will essentially, if you spend 75% of your time behind a screen, you know, doing things and running reports or whatever, those are things that AI can do. And those are things that probably don't bring you joy. The things that bring you joy are the things that, are the last mile. And so to really be honest and audit the things that don't bring you joy, figuring out areas in which AI can actually help support those, then all of a sudden you're going to do more things that bring you joy. And then it becomes this really virtuous cycle.
Just a couple more questions in the time we have left. I was wondering if you could do a bit more of a preview of your upcoming book, what it's about, when will it be available, and how folks can be on the lookout to pre-order that.
Yeah, it's cranking along. So Gabe Cooper, who's the founder of Virtuous, he's written 2 books on this framework called responsive fundraising. I've written 2 books. Not surprising, several years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago, when I opened his first book, his first chapter is called The Generosity Crisis. And so earlier this year, we thought, you know what if all 4 of our books had a baby, and it became like a definitive or declarative vision of the future of fundraising. And it's, he has been in the field as a software developer, as like I mean, runs a CRM company, but he built it himself. And so he doing that, and from a tactical perspective, and mine from a more philosophical, like I studied macroeconomics and geopolitical studies. And so I look at how all this stuff comes together. The book really came to me from my work at City of Hope and UCSD when I worked in health sciences, where it was this idea that precision medicine, essentially, AI changed everything for precision medicine. Is that there's, no patient has, breast cancer or prostate cancer, that every person has a unique kind of cancer related to their DNA, their genome will actually dictate the kind of cancer. So when drugs are prescribed, they're prescribed specifically to that person's DNA. So one drug with a person with prostate cancer might help one person, might hurt another person, and might not do anything for a third. So the genetic profiling changes this N of one concept, where it's like every person's unique and the therapy as prescribed specifically. And so applied, taking that to philanthropy, again, it frees us from this idea that there's donors over here and there's prospects over here and just crude segments. And our segments are based on averages. And to think about what could be possible if every person was an N of one. Like anyone who's had a child knows that their child is unique. As their child is an N of one. There's no other child like their child specifically. And so could a nonprofit essentially build an ecosystem that was able to on demand essentially be able to form and support a relationship as an N of one. And so it's a book that talks about it's a little bit future oriented, but it's all based in technology that exists today, knowing that it rests on kind of three main technology domains, which is predictive AI that predicts things, generative AI that creates things, and agentic AI that essentially helps automate those things. And so, yeah, the book will come out. In fact, yeah, 3 more chapters. We're in May. It's like hard to say. We'll probably have the book we haven't said, at the very longest, it will be on National Philanthropy Day, which is in November. But I'm thinking, I think we're going to get, bullish on it and probably push it up to September.
And that's fantastic. I can't wait to add it to our book club and read that in a future opportunity. But to that end, I was going to ask you about a book recommendation that the speaking engagement team might think about reading next with our community. Are there any books that stand out in your mind as essential reading for anyone who's doing engagement, community building in the realm of nonprofits?
I mean, in the realm of nonprofit, it's hard, right? Because there's not as many. I mean, the book that I keep on coming back to that a lot of people come back to me from or with is Unreasonable Hospitality. And I don't know if you've read that book by Will Giarda. It's essentially about the food industry, but it is that if you're in philanthropy and you read it, you can't unsee it. And so it's amazing. Unreasonable Hospitality has so many appropriate examples that it speaks to our work in philanthropy. So it's a fantastic book. It's been a best-selling book since it came out a couple of years ago. And who doesn't like food too? So you're just like getting a lot of fun stuff in there.
Designing experiences, food is at the epicenter of a lot of what we do in nonprofits, bringing people together.
Right. Yep.
Nathan Chappell, thank you so much for your time today. It was great to speak with you. I learned a ton, and I know our listeners will as well. Thank you for joining
Great.
us.
Yeah. What a fun conversation. Thanks so much, Ryan.